Well, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the Nieman Foundation for this honor, and especially Bill and Myra and Anne-Marie for thinking that I deserved it. It's a special honor for me because I admired I.F. Stone's independent journalism so much. As Bill mentioned, that when I was at Colby College, I even lobbied the school library to subscribe to his newsletter. Reading it weekly shaped how I came to view journalism as a profession that required endless skepticism. And I had the privilege of meeting him once in the early 1980s. I was an investigative reporter then for the Associated Press in Washington. I had gotten hold of some documents, some classified documents about financial misconduct in El Salvador. He called and asked if he could come and read the documents, and so I said sure, and he showed up at the AP office on K Street. And through his thick glasses, and I think he might have had a magnifying glass too at the time, he spent a couple of hours poring through those papers. So I shared Izzy Stone's view that journalists should be the consummate outsiders. I spent my first part of my career as a mainstream journalist, but I never forgot his insistence on maintaining your independence at all costs, whatever the pressures. To me, the core responsibility of a journalist is to have an open mind toward any information you might find, to have no agenda, and to have no preferred outcome. In other words, I don't care what the truth is, I just care what the truth is. That's the deal you make with your readers. You have to follow the leads wherever they go. I also consider this award a recognition of what we've accomplished at consortiumnews.com. Over the past 2 decades. This honor goes to the many talented reporters and analysts who have written for us. They have made Consortium News a place where you can find thoughtful, well-researched, well-reported information, stories well worth reading almost every single day. And for those of you who don't know much about Consortium News, let me give you a brief history. The project began out of my frustration with the mainstream news media where I'd spent many years. I worked at the AP from 1974 to 1987. I was perhaps best known for breaking many of the stories we now know as the Iran-Contra scandal. These included the first article about a little-known Marine officer named Oliver North, and with my AP colleague Brian Barger, the first story about how some of the Nicaraguan Contra rebels had gotten themselves mixed up in the drug trade. To say that these and other stories weren't always popular would be a bit of an understatement. But they were well reported, and they were borne out when the Iran-Contra scandal exploded in late 1986. I then got a job offer from Newsweek, and I felt it was time to move on. Sadly, I had burned many bridges at the AP in the fights to push our stories to the wire. But what I found at Newsweek was even more troubling. There was an allegiance more to the powerful than to the public. At senior levels, there was a stubborn reluctance to pursue the Iran-Contra scandal to its roots, out of fear that it could destroy another Republican president. This may sound odd, but the attitude inside Newsweek, which was then part of the Washington Post company, was that we don't need another Watergate. They did not want another constitutional crisis that was not deemed good for the country. So I left Newsweek in 1990 and worked on some documentaries for PBS Frontline. But it was becoming increasingly clear to me that the space for serious investigative journalism was closing down. With the arrival of Bill Clinton, there was a market for silly, tawdry scandals, but there was even less interest in the unsolved mysteries of the 1980s. These were old-fashioned, complicated stories without much sex. But a key moment occurred in late 1994. When I got access to the raw files of a congressional inquiry into an Iran-Contra spin-off scandal known generically as the October Surprise. This was really an issue of whether or not the Iran-Contra, the sales of arms by the US government to the Iranians had really begun not in 1985 and 1986 as the official story was, but much earlier, that they'd begun back in 1981. And according to a number of well-placed sources, including people like Assistant Secretary of State Nick Veliotis. These arrangements really grew out of the Republican campaign in 1980 when Republicans were making behind-the-scenes contacts with the Iranians without President Carter's knowledge. So these documents were quite interesting, and they've been, the investigation had ended in sort of a non-committal way. They couldn't find really evidence to support that these events had occurred. So they basically just wrapped it up at the beginning of the Clinton administration and said, well, there's not really hard evidence here. But they left behind a number of their records. And in late 1994, after the Republicans had won the control of the Congress but hadn't yet taken over, I thought it would be a good time perhaps to get hold of whatever documents they had left behind. So I got permission from the House Foreign Affairs Committee to go look at their unpublished records, supposedly obviously unclassified stuff. And they led me. I'd covered Congress for a number of years, but they led me to a place I never knew existed in Congress. I went into the Rayburn building on Capitol Hill, down an elevator, into the parking garage, and had to wind my way through a parking garage, and they'd put up sort of some makeshift office space in the garage. And so I knocked on the door, and this young guy came and let me in. And he said, oh yes, I heard you were coming, and I'm told you can look at these documents. You can make copies of only 12 pages. They had an old copying machine. And he led me through this little warren of offices, where basically just him and me, into an abandoned ladies' room. And this is how your government sort of works. So in the ladies' room, there was even an empty tampon dispenser on the wall. They had piled all these boxes on the floor. And so I sat down and started opening up the boxes, and the young fellow was just before Christmas. He was talking to his girlfriend on the phone. And I opened up the boxes, and I began to realize that they had left behind secret and top secret material. So I volunteered to make the copies myself. And it was one of those old, big, lumbering copy machines that you don't see anymore, but they were back then. You would see them, and so I sort of covered the red top secret stamps all over these things, and began putting them into the machine. And it kept jamming, but I kept saying, I know how these machines work. I can take care of it. So I made my 12 copies or whatever I was allowed, and then I sort of snuck them out, left Capitol Hill, and then I went back a couple times to get my another 12 pages. So over a couple of weeks, I was able to get a number of interesting documents, which I thought sort of changed how we'd understand the 1980s. But I prepared a report summarizing what the documents showed, but I kept running into disinterest among the major news organizations that I tried to get them to, and even some that weren't that major. So the feeling was that this was just an utter frustration of trying to deal with issues that people thought were historical. They didn't really care that much anymore. So one day in 1995, I was complaining about this, and my oldest son, Sam, who had just finished college, was home, and he said, Dad, instead of complaining, why don't you go to the internet, and they have things they call websites, and we could publish them. So I said, well, I really didn't know the internet. I'd heard about it. And Sam was not a techie, but he set out, and back then there were no templates. You had to basically build it from scratch. So we had a rather rustic-looking internet site, but we began publishing these secret and top secret documents and the stories that derived from them. So that was the beginning of consortiumnews.com 20 years ago. It actually started in November of 1995, so we're just about at the 20th birthday of our little project. And the original idea was to provide a home for neglected investigative journalists and their work. I thought I could raise significant amounts of money from a variety of sources, thus the rather clunky name Consortium News. But I soon learned that independent journalism, while it's popular in the abstract, is not something people really want to invest much in. They prefer to know how the stories are going to end up before they give you the money. So we always struggled with money, but we did build a loyal readership. We kept this going with small donations mostly. To my pleasant surprise, I also discovered that a number of ex-CIA analysts were looking for a place to publish their work. They shared our concern that the United States was veering away from fact-based policies. They felt that this decoupling from reality was careening the country toward international catastrophes, and they were right. I'd be happy to respond to any specific issues that we've dealt with over the past 2 decades, from world affairs to domestic politics, but suffice it to say that what we mostly do is take on mindless groupthinks, of which there are many in official Washington. We are relentlessly independent. That may not make us popular with some people, but I think I.F. Stone would approve.